Sarah felt the change in the air before she saw the sky darken. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees in less than an hour, and the wind carried the peculiar metallic smell that always came before a serious storm. She stood on the porch of the farmhouse, watching the horizon with growing unease. The weather report had mentioned possible thunderstorms, but nothing like what those black clouds promised. Her phone buzzed with an emergency alert. Severe thunderstorm warning. Possible tornado activity. Seek shelter immediately. Sarah's heart hammered as she looked toward the fields where her husband Marcus was working on the irrigation system. She could barely make out his figure in the distance, but she knew he hadn't seen the sky yet. He was too focused on fixing the broken pipe that had been flooding the west field for 2 days. She grabbed the air horn they kept for emergencies and blasted 3 long signals. Their code for danger. Marcus's head snapped up, and even from 200 yards away, she could see him stiffen when he turned toward the western sky. The wall of clouds looked like something out of an apocalypse movie, roiling and churning with a sickly green tint that made Sarah's stomach clench with fear. Marcus started running toward the house, but Sarah could see he wouldn't make it in time. The wind was already picking up, bending the tall grass in waves and sending loose debris tumbling across the yard. Then she heard it, that sound every farmer in tornado country dreaded. A low rumble that grew into a roar, like a freight train bearing down on them from the heavens. The barn. Sarah screamed, though she knew Marcus couldn't hear her over the wind. She pointed frantically toward the old structure that stood between him and the house. It was closer, and right now, closer meant survival. Marcus changed direction without hesitation, sprinting toward the weathered red building as the first fat raindrops began to fall. Sarah ran too, her feet pounding across the gravel driveway. She could hear things crashing in the yard behind her, the porch chairs, the metal watering can, maybe even parts of the fence. The wind shoved at her back like giant hands, propelling her forward faster than she'd ever run in her life. The rain came in sheets now, cold and stinging against her skin. Marcus reached the barn door first and hauled it open against the wind. Sarah dove through the opening, and he slammed it shut behind her just as something large and heavy crashed against the outside wall. The entire structure shuddered, dust raining down from the old rafters overhead. They stood there gasping, soaked to the bone, staring at each other in the dim light that filtered through the cracks in the walls. "Is this thing going to hold?" Sarah shouted over the roar of the storm. Marcus looked around at the barn they'd been meaning to repair for 3 years. The roof had missing shingles, the walls had gaps, and the whole building leaned slightly to the east. But it had stood for almost a century, through countless storms. "It has to," he said, reaching for her hand. The wind screamed around them like a living thing, and through the cracks in the walls, they could see debris flying past, branches, sheets of metal roofing, things they couldn't identify in the chaos. The barn groaned and swayed, and Sarah found herself praying to a God she hadn't talked to since childhood. "Please let it hold. Please let us survive this." Then the lights went out completely as something massive struck the exterior, and they were plunged into darkness so absolute that Sarah couldn't see her own hand in front of her face. All they had was each other, the sound of their breathing barely audible over the storm's fury, and the terrible hope that their refuge would be strong enough to save them. The darkness was suffocating. Marcus fumbled in his pocket for his phone, his hands shaking from adrenaline and cold. The screen's glow seemed impossibly bright in the pitch black, casting harsh shadows across Sarah's face. She looked terrified, and he knew he probably looked the same. The battery icon showed 18%. They'd have to use the light sparingly. "We need to get away from the walls," Marcus said, guiding Sarah toward the center of the barn. His boots crunched on scattered hay and debris. They'd been storing old farm equipment in here, and now he tried to remember the layout in the darkness. The tractor was against the north wall. The workbench on the south side. In the middle, there should be some old furniture covered with tarps. Sarah gripped his arm so tightly it hurt. What was that sound? Did something hit the roof? Before Marcus could answer, another massive impact shook the barn. This time, they heard wood splintering. A section of the roof near the back corner tore away with a scream of nails pulling free from old timber. Rain poured through the gap like a waterfall, and the wind howled through the new opening with renewed fury. "We need to get low." Marcus pulled Sarah down beside an old hay bale, using his body to shield her from the debris that was starting to swirl through the barn's interior. Loose hay, dust, and small pieces of wood pelted them. He could taste dirt in his mouth, feel it stinging his eyes. Sarah pressed her face against his shoulder. "The house," she said, her voice breaking. "Marcus, what about the house?" He didn't answer because he couldn't lie to her, and the truth was too terrible to speak. If the storm was doing this to the barn, their house might already be gone. Everything they'd built together over 12 years of marriage, the nursery they'd just finished painting, the kitchen they'd renovated last summer, the photos and memories and all the tangible pieces of their life, could be scattered across 3 counties by now. The wind shifted, and suddenly the barn door they'd come through exploded inward, torn completely off its hinges. The massive wooden panel flew across the interior and crashed into the tractor with a sound like a gunshot. Sarah screamed, and Marcus threw himself over her completely as the wind roared through the barn like a beast unchained. Things were flying everywhere now. He felt something sharp strike his back, then something else hit his leg. The pain was immediate and intense, but he didn't dare move. He had to protect Sarah. That was all that mattered. The wind tried to pry them apart, pulling at their clothes, their hair, their very skin. Marcus locked his arms around his wife and held on with everything he had. "I love you," Sarah shouted directly into his ear, the only way he could hear her over the cacophony. "I love you so much." "I love you too," he shouted back, and then the world became nothing but noise and chaos and the desperate struggle to hold on to each other while the storm tried to tear them apart. It felt like hours but was probably only minutes before the worst of the wind began to subside. The roar diminished gradually to a howl, then to a strong gust, then to something almost normal. Marcus risked raising his head and shining his phone light around. The barn looked like a bomb had gone off inside it. Equipment was overturned, the roof had multiple holes, and debris was scattered everywhere. But the main structure still stood. The walls were intact. They were alive. Sarah was crying, her whole body shaking with sobs of relief and residual fear. Marcus held her close, his own eyes burning with tears he refused to let fall. They stayed like that for a long time, just breathing, just being grateful for breath. When Sarah finally pulled back, her face was streaked with dirt and tears. "Is it over?" Marcus listened carefully. The rain had lessened to a steady pour instead of a deluge, and the wind sounded normal, just a regular storm now instead of the monster that had tried to kill them. "I think the tornado passed," he said. "But the storm's not done yet." They helped each other stand, both wincing at various injuries they'd sustained. Marcus's leg throbbed where something had hit it, and he could feel blood trickling down his back. Sarah had a cut on her forehead and bruises already forming on her arms. But they were mobile. They were okay. "We should check the door," Sarah said, then laughed shakily. "Or where the door used to be." Marcus shined his light toward the opening. His heart sank. Where there had been a doorway, there was now a wall of debris. The tornado had piled tree branches, parts of fencing, twisted metal, and unidentifiable wreckage against the barn's entrance, completely blocking their way out. He moved the light to where the door had blown inward. Same story. Debris piled high. "Marcus." Sarah's voice was very small. "Can we get out?" He checked every wall, every gap, every possible exit. But the answer was clear and terrifying. They were trapped, injured, with a dying phone battery and no way to call for help. The storm raged on outside their damaged refuge, and nobody knew where they were. The cold set in gradually, so slowly that Sarah didn't notice at first. She'd been too busy trying to help Marcus clear debris from the main door, working by the light of his phone until the battery died completely. Now they sat in absolute darkness, exhausted and defeated, and she realized she was shivering uncontrollably. Her wet clothes clung to her skin like ice, and the temperature had dropped dramatically as night approached. "We need to stay warm," Marcus said, his teeth chattering. She could hear him moving around in the darkness, shuffling carefully to avoid the scattered debris. "There should be some old tops over here. And I think there's a box of emergency supplies somewhere." Sarah hugged herself, trying to preserve what little body heat she had left. "How long do you think before someone finds us?" Marcus didn't answer right away, which told her everything she needed to know. Nobody knew they were in the barn. The nearest neighbors were the Hendersons, 2 miles down the road, and they'd probably assumed Marcus and Sarah had sheltered in their house's basement like sensible people. It could be hours before anyone came looking. It could be days. "Here," Marcus said, and she felt him drape something heavy and dry over her shoulders. It smelled like dust and motor oil, but it was wonderfully thick. "It's a canvas tarp. Not much, but it'll help." They huddled together under the tarp, sharing body heat in the impenetrable darkness. Sarah's mind raced with worries. Were they injured worse than they thought? Could they have internal bleeding or concussions? What if the barn collapsed while they slept? What if no one found them before they died of exposure? "Stop," Marcus said softly, as if reading her thoughts. "I can hear you thinking from here, and it's not helping either of us. How can you tell me not to worry?" Sarah's voice rose with the edge of hysteria she couldn't quite control. We're trapped in a falling-apart barn with no phone, no light, no way out, and nobody knows we're here. I know. Marcus's arm tightened around her. But panicking won't change any of that. What we can do is stay calm, stay warm, and wait for morning. In daylight, we'll be able to see better, maybe find a way to dig out or signal for help. Sarah took a shaky breath, then another, forcing herself to calm down. Marcus was right. They had to think clearly. They had to survive the night first. Tell me something, she said. Tell me something good. Something to think about besides all this. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Remember our first date? When I took you to that fancy restaurant and spilled an entire glass of red wine on my white shirt. Despite everything, Sarah felt a smile tugging at her lips. You were so embarrassed. Your face was redder than the wine. I thought I'd ruined everything, Marcus continued, his voice warm with the memory. I thought there was no way you'd ever want to see me again after I showed up late, spilled wine all over myself, and then couldn't get my credit card to work. But then you laughed, Sarah said. You just started laughing at yourself, and that's when I knew. That's when I knew you were the one. They talked through the long hours of darkness, sharing memories like lifelines. Their wedding day, when it had rained so hard they'd had to move the ceremony inside at the last minute. The first time they'd seen this farm and fallen in love with its rolling fields and ancient oak trees. The miscarriage 2 years ago that had nearly broken them both. The slow, painful journey back to each other afterward. Sarah's voice grew hoarse. Do you think we'll have another chance? To have a baby, I mean. Yes, Marcus said without hesitation. We'll get through this, and we'll have that family we've dreamed about. I promise you. You can't promise that. Watch me. The hours crawled by. The rain continued, sometimes heavy, sometimes light, but never stopping. Water dripped through the holes in the roof, creating a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. Sarah dozed fitfully, jerking awake whenever the barn creaked or the wind picked up. Every time she woke, Marcus was there, solid and warm beside her, keeping watch in the darkness. Sometime deep in the night, Sarah woke to the sound of Marcus's breathing, fast and shallow. Hey, she said, touching his face. His skin was burning hot. Marcus, you're running a fever. I'm fine, he said, but his voice was weak. Just tired. Sarah's heart began to pound with fresh fear. She ran her hands over him carefully, methodically, checking for injuries in the darkness. When she touched his left side, he gasped in pain. Her fingers came away wet. Blood. Fresh blood, still flowing. Marcus, you're bleeding. Why didn't you tell me? Didn't want you to worry, he mumbled. It's not that bad. But Sarah knew it was bad. She could feel the warm wetness spreading across his shirt. In the darkness, she couldn't see how much blood he'd lost, but if he was running a fever, infection might already be setting in. She needed to stop the bleeding, needed to keep the wound clean, but she had nothing. No first aid kit, no clean bandages, no light to see what she was doing. Think, she commanded herself. Think like the farm girl you are. She'd grown up on a ranch, had dealt with injured animals, had learned basic emergency care from her veterinarian father. She could do this. She had to do this. I need you to stay awake, she told Marcus firmly. Talk to me. Keep talking. She tore strips from the hem of her shirt, working by touch alone. The fabric was still damp, but it was the best she had. She pressed the wadded cloth against Marcus's side, applying pressure. He groaned, but she didn't relent. She had to stop the bleeding. Tell me about the new irrigation system, she said, keeping her voice steady even though she was terrified. The one you wanted to install next spring. Marcus's voice was getting weaker, but he tried. He talked about water flow and pressure systems, his words becoming increasingly slurred. Sarah kept pressure on the wound, kept him talking, and prayed harder than she'd ever prayed in her life. Dawn had to come eventually. Help had to come. They just had to survive until then. The first gray light of dawn filtered through the holes in the barn roof like a gift from heaven. Sarah had never been so grateful to see anything in her entire life. She could finally assess their situation properly, and what she saw made her stomach turn. Marcus was pale, his lips tinged with blue. The makeshift bandage she'd pressed against his side was soaked through with blood. She needed help, and she needed it now. Marcus, can you hear me? She patted his face gently, her hands trembling. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy. Cold, he whispered. So cold. Sarah looked around the barn with desperate eyes, seeing it clearly for the first time since they'd taken shelter. The destruction was worse than she'd imagined. The tornado had torn away nearly a third of the roof, and debris was piled everywhere. But more importantly, she could now see potential escape routes. The back wall had a gap where the boards had split apart. It wasn't large, but it might be enough. She also spotted something that made her heart leap with hope: the old emergency box Marcus had mentioned, half buried under fallen rafters near the workbench. If she could reach it, there might be supplies inside. Maybe even a flashlight or a first aid kit. "I'll be right back," she told Marcus, tucking the tarp more tightly around him. "Don't you dare give up on me." She picked her way carefully across the debris-strewn floor, every muscle in her body screaming in protest. Her own injuries made themselves known now that the adrenaline was wearing off: the cut on her forehead, the deep bruises on her ribs, the twisted ankle she'd been ignoring all night. But none of that mattered. Marcus was dying, and she was the only one who could save him. The emergency box was pinned under a heavy beam. Sarah braced herself and lifted with her legs, just like her father had taught her. The beam shifted, and she managed to drag the metal box free. Her hands shook as she pried open the lid. Inside, she found a battery-powered lantern, a basic first aid kit, some emergency thermal blankets, and, thank God, a flare gun with 3 flares. Sarah grabbed the first aid kit and hurried back to Marcus. His breathing had become more labored, each inhale a visible effort. She tore open the kit, finding antiseptic, proper bandages, and antibiotic ointment. It wasn't much, but it was infinitely better than torn shirt fabric. "This is going to hurt," she warned him, then carefully peeled away the soaked makeshift bandage. The wound was deep, a jagged gash along his left side where something sharp had torn through his shirt and into his flesh. It was still bleeding, though slower now. Sarah cleaned it as best she could, her hands steady despite her terror. Marcus groaned but didn't cry out, which worried her more than screaming would have. He was too weak even for that. She applied the antibiotic ointment liberally, then wrapped his torso with the proper bandages, making them as tight as she dared. The thermal blanket from the emergency kit went over him next, its reflective surface designed to trap body heat. But it wasn't enough. He needed a hospital, needed real medical care, needed things she couldn't give him here. Sarah grabbed the flare gun and made her way to the biggest hole in the roof. She aimed skyward and pulled the trigger. The flare shot up with a whoosh, arcing into the pale morning sky and exploding in a brilliant red star. She watched it hang there, burning bright, a desperate beacon that screamed, "We're here, we need help, please find us." Then she fired another, and another, using all 3 flares. She could only pray that someone would see them. The Hendersons. A rescue team. Anyone. With nothing left to do but wait, Sarah returned to Marcus's side and took his hand. It was so cold, like holding ice. "Remember what you promised me?" she said, her voice breaking. "About the baby? About our family? You don't get to break that promise, Marcus. You don't get to leave me alone." Marcus's eyes opened, just barely. "Not going anywhere," he mumbled. "You're stuck with me." "Damn right I am." Time became elastic, stretching and compressing in strange ways. Sarah found herself talking to Marcus even when he didn't respond, telling him stories, making plans for the future, promising him all the things they'd do when they got out of here. They'd fix up the barn properly. They'd take that vacation to Ireland they'd been dreaming about. They'd try again for a baby. They'd grow old together, watching sunsets from their porch, surrounded by grandchildren. She was in the middle of describing the garden she wanted to plant when she heard it, the distant thrum of a helicopter. Sarah's head snapped up, her heart hammering. Was it real, or was exhaustion making her hallucinate? The sound grew louder, definitely real, definitely coming closer. She scrambled to her feet and ran to the gap in the wall, waving her arms frantically. "Here. We're here. Down here." She grabbed the orange tarp and waved it like a flag, making herself as visible as possible. The helicopter passed overhead, and for one terrible moment, Sarah thought they hadn't seen her. Then it circled back, hovering over the barn. A voice boomed through a loudspeaker, "We see you. Help is coming. Stay where you are." Sarah collapsed to her knees, sobbing with relief. They were saved. Marcus was going to live. They were going to make it. Within minutes, she heard vehicles approaching, voices shouting, the sounds of rescue. A team of firefighters began clearing the debris from the main entrance, working with organized efficiency. A paramedic squeezed through the gap in the wall, an angel in a navy blue uniform. "My husband," Sarah said, pointing. "He's hurt bad. He's been bleeding all night." The paramedic moved quickly to Marcus's side, assessing him with practiced hands. More paramedics arrived, bringing a stretcher, medical equipment, hope. Sarah watched them work, staying out of the way, her whole body shaking with exhaustion and relief. We need to check you too, someone said, but Sarah shook her head. I'm fine. Just take care of him. Please. They loaded Marcus onto the stretcher, starting in 4, stabilizing him for transport. As they carried him toward the cleared entrance, his hand reached out, searching. Sarah grabbed it, holding tight. I've got you, she said. I'll always have you. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beep of monitors and the soft hiss of oxygen. Sarah sat in the chair beside Marcus's bed, holding his hand like she'd been doing for the past 18 hours. He'd been in surgery for 4 hours to repair the damage to his side, then in recovery, and now finally he was here, pale but breathing steadily, alive. The doctor had said he'd been lucky. Another hour, maybe 2, and the blood loss combined with the infection starting in the wound could have killed him. Lucky. Sarah thought about that word. Lucky that a tornado had trapped them in a collapsing barn where Marcus had been impaled by debris? Or lucky that they'd survived it all? She knew which one she'd choose. Marcus's eyes fluttered open, focusing slowly. When he saw her, a weak smile crossed his face. Hey, he croaked. Hey yourself, Sarah said, fighting back tears. How do you feel? Like I got hit by a tornado. He tried to laugh, then winced. Too soon for jokes. Way too soon. But Sarah was smiling through her tears, squeezing his hand gently. You scared me half to death, you know that. Sorry. Marcus's expression grew serious. The house? Sarah had been dreading this question. She'd seen the footage on the news, taken the phone call from their insurance agent, processed the reality while Marcus had been unconscious. It's gone, she said quietly. The tornado took most of it. What's left isn't salvageable. She watched the news hit him, saw the grief flash across his face. 12 years of their lives, reduced to rubble and scattered memories. The nursery that would never hold their child. The kitchen where they'd shared countless meals and conversations. The bedroom where they'd held each other through good times and bad. All of it, just gone. But we're alive, Sarah added firmly. That's what matters. We're alive, and we're together, and everything else can be rebuilt. Marcus nodded slowly, blinking back tears. The barn? Still standing. Damaged, but standing. Sarah couldn't help but laugh at the irony. The structure we've been saying we need to tear down for 3 years is the only building on the property that survived. The universe has a twisted sense of humor. Over the next few days, as Marcus grew stronger, they began to piece together what had happened that day. The tornado had been in EF3, cutting a path of destruction 3 miles long and half a mile wide. Their farm had been near the center of that path. 4 other houses in the area had been destroyed, but miraculously, no one else had been killed or seriously injured. The Hendersons had been the ones to call in the rescue after seeing Sarah's flares. They'd been searching for survivors all morning and had just been about to check the barn when they saw the red stars in the sky. The community response was overwhelming. Friends, neighbors, even strangers showed up with offers of help. The local church organized a fundraiser. The Farm Bureau provided emergency housing. People donated clothes, furniture, food, money, anything they thought might help. Sarah had always known they lived in a good community, but this outpouring of support brought her to tears multiple times a day. On Marcus's 5th day in the hospital, Sarah brought her laptop to his room. I want to show you something, she said, opening it to a folder of photos. I went back to the farm yesterday. Marcus sat up straighter, his eyes fixed on the screen as Sarah clicked through images. The house was indeed gone, nothing but a foundation and scattered debris. The fields were littered with wreckage. The oak trees they'd loved were either uprooted or snapped in half. It looked like a war zone. Then Sarah pulled up the last photo, and Marcus's breath caught. It was the barn, battered and torn but still standing. And painted across its side in huge letters, put there by someone in the community, were the words, "Still here. Still strong." I've been thinking, Sarah said softly. What if we rebuild? Not just the house, but everything. We could make the barn the centerpiece, restore it properly, turn it into something beautiful. A reminder of what we survived. Marcus looked at her, really looked at her, and Sarah saw the moment the idea took hold. The grief in his eyes transformed into something else. Hope. Determination. Purpose. Would need to redesign everything, he said, his mind already working through the logistics. The house layout, the outbuildings, the whole farm infrastructure. I know. It's crazy, right? Starting completely over at our age? We're 34, Sarah. We're not ancient. Marcus's grip on her hand tightened. And yeah, it's crazy. But maybe crazy is exactly what we need. They spent hours talking about possibilities, sketching rough plans on napkins, dreaming bigger than they'd ever allowed themselves to dream before. The tornado had taken almost everything from them, but it had also given them something unexpected, a blank slate. A chance to rebuild not just their farm, but their entire lives, exactly the way they wanted. 6 weeks later, Marcus was discharged from the hospital. Sarah drove him back to the farm, where a small camper trailer had been set up for them to live in during the rebuilding process. As they pulled up the long driveway, Marcus stared at the barn, at those painted words that had become their motto. "Still here, still strong," he murmured. "Damn right we are," Sarah agreed. They got out of the truck slowly, both of them still healing. The evening sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, and despite the devastation around them, it was beautiful. Sarah slipped her hand into Marcus's, and they stood there together, looking at the work ahead of them. "You know what?" Marcus said. "I think we're going to need a bigger barn." Sarah laughed, the sound carrying across the empty fields. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we turn it into a wedding venue. Restore it, make it beautiful, and share it with people. Let it be a place where good things happen, where people start their lives together. It survived the worst storm we've ever seen. That means something." Sarah turned to look at him, seeing the vision forming in his mind. "And where does our house go in this grand plan?" "Right here." Marcus pointed to a spot with a view of both the barn and the western fields. "Where we can watch the sunsets every night and remember how lucky we are to be alive to see them." They stood there planning and dreaming until the stars came out, two people who'd been through hell and come out the other side stronger for it. The road ahead would be long and difficult. There would be setbacks and frustrations, moments of despair and exhaustion. But they'd survived a tornado together. They'd kept each other alive through the longest night of their lives. Everything else was just details. As Sarah looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, she thought about the child they'd lost, the house that was gone, the life they'd had before the storm. She mourned those things, would probably always carry that grief. But she also felt something else growing inside her, gratitude for what remained. For Marcus, healing but whole. For this land that was still theirs. For the future they'd build together from the ruins. "I love you," she said, the words carrying the weight of everything they'd been through. "I love you too," Marcus replied, pulling her close. "Still here, still strong." "Still here, still strong," Sarah echoed. And there, beside the barn that had saved their lives, under a sky full of stars, they began again.